I would like to welcome all of you to our session OER as Professional Development, Building Bridges Among Faculty, Staff, and Students. Our presenters, Amy Fisher, Donnie Winter, and Michelle Pratt, will further introduce themselves, and I will turn it over to them now. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to have you, and we hope that you had a lovely lunch period. I think that was the period right before this was the lunchtime, right? So my name is Donnie Winter, and thank you, Gina, for that introduction. I teach English at Delta College, and I am joined by two of my favorite people in the universe, and I will let them introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. My name is Amy Schmidt. I am the English professor, and I do mean the English professor at the Saginaw Chippewa Tribal College. We are a very small college, so there are only 6 full-time faculty members. I also run the liberal arts program over there, but I spent 5 glorious years at Delta College working with both Michelle and Donnie. I'm a huge supporter. We do a lot of collaborative efforts between the 2 colleges, so it's kind of like I'm still there anyway.
Right.
Hi, I'm Michelle Pratt. I'm the library manager at Delta College.
So moving on to the next slide. So just to kind of give you an overview of what we will be talking about throughout this presentation, we're going to be talking about how OER began at Delta College years ago. Amy and I are going to be talking about our textbook for developmental reading that we developed. Just going to share that process, kind of some of the challenges and successes that we experienced with it. And then we're going to transition to Michelle. I'm talking a little bit about the significance of library and research staff, because we really want to emphasize the importance of collaboration during our panel. We're going to move on to understanding publication interfaces. We're going to talk about student perspectives on OER, and then we are going to talk about the opportunities OER presents, whether that be professional development opportunities or publication opportunities in the future. And the unique thing about our presentation is that we are going to have Q&A opportunities throughout the presentation, meaning after each of these segments, there's going to be a Q&A segment where we will give you the opportunity to ask us questions, and we will also pose a question that you can answer for us also. We're doing this because we understand that sometimes if we wait for Q&A to be at the end of a presentation, it's very easy, at least for me, to forget questions that I might have unless I write them down. So we're hoping that it might make it a little bit more conversational and a little bit easier for everybody to just interact, okay? So Michelle, let's start off by talking a little bit about how OER began at Delta College.
Okay, back in the fall of 2015, Lansing Community College held an OER summit for their faculty, and they invited other people who were interested to come. I attended, Dr. Reva Curry, our vice president for academics, attended, and some faculty members. And that sort of got the ball rolling. We came back and talked about it. Dr. Curry shared her notes with some faculty members, and people started to get interested. A year later, in the fall of 2016, the first course adopted OER. It was a sociology course, and they adopted the OpenStax book. So they were our early adopters. They've been really great, and they're poised to be the first department that is 100% OER. In the fall of 2017, we announced our incentive program. Faculty could apply to adopt, adapt, or create a textbook. We awarded 5 grants. Donnie and Amy received 1 for their textbook that they're going to talk about in a little bit. The next fall, in 2018, we formed a steering committee. Up until now, it was sort of informal. At this point, we recruited at least one faculty member from each division. We had 2 co-chairs, myself and Dr. Laura Dahl, history professor. I think we work well together because it's all about collaboration. And we have the library research part of it and the faculty part of it. The faculty, they lend support, they recruit among their divisions, they report statistics to me. So it's a great help. We have a guide like most academic libraries do. We've done a board presentation. We hosted the 2019 Michigan Colleges Online OER Summit at Delta College. We participated in the 2020 U.S. Department of Education grant. We applied, we weren't selected, but I think we made a very strong proposal and also came up with some great partnerships with other colleges, which was huge. So far, as of April 2021, our students have saved $757,000, and we're poised to hit the $1 million mark in April 2022.
Every time I hear those statistics, they just make me giddy. Thank you, Michelle, for sharing that. So now we're going to transition into a Q&A segment, and we're going to leave a couple of minutes for this for anybody to chime in if they have any thoughts. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. And while you are contemplating those questions, I do have a question to propose in the group. How did OER adoption begin at your institution?
One of the reasons we wanted to do this is part of our goal for this whole conference, right, is this building bridges. So we are really, really interested in finding out how different colleges have done this. If it was similar grant processes, feel free to, raise your hand and or enter your answer into the chat. We'd love to get both kinds of feedback.
And if for some reason, like later on during our panel, like if you think of an answer to one of the questions we've posed early on, like you can still like respond to that question later on, like if it helps you. Okay. So we'll give about another minute or so to see if anybody responds.
Thanks, Laura.
Laura has responded. Jessica has responded. So Jessica says, in 2017, our instructional design team dove into OER to bring it back to our university, and we presented it at the Michigan OER Summit of 2017.
Jessica, is that presentation still available somewhere? Do you have that information by chance you could share with us?
Oh, Spring Arbor University. Okay. I was about to ask that. Yeah. And then Laura says from Lansing Community College, we got the OER ball rolling.
Karen says at Walsh, we did receive an LSTA grant. What is that grant? Can you spell that out for me?
I like that the focus was not an incentive, but educating the faculty about OER. That is very significant, which is in some way a process that we are still in at Delta as well. Let's see, Nancy from Chattanooga State Community College got a grant to make early and modern US history fully OER. That's really interesting.
That's rock and roll. Library Science and Technology Act. Thank you, Karen. I appreciate that. Awesome. I love this. So at the end, everyone can save the chat because I'm hoping that this ends up being one of those amazing collaborative resources through this process. Awesome.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to go forward and move to the next segment. Okay. There we go. My slide was not working for a moment. Okay. So now Amy and I are going to talk a little bit about our textbook, Literacy for College Success, and how it began. Amy, would you like to start us off?
I would. So first off, I am putting the link to our textbook into the chat right now so you guys can go and look at it. We license this Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike, and that is the license that we used in order to collaborate. So we ended up with, it was Donnie who emailed me one day. We started as adjunct professors at Delta College in the same semester in fall of 2016. And because we did our orientation together, we were in the same discipline, we ended up kind of connecting. And he sent me an email and said, there's this OER grant. We're both teaching this reading class. Do you want to try to do an OER book? And I'm like, for real, I do. And then so, you know, we applied for it. We got together, did the proposal, and then we were selected. And that's when the learning curve began. So one of our first things that we did was say, hey, Michelle, how the heck do we do this? You know, like, so I love the idea of open resources. And I've always used, you know, free links and the Purdue OWL and all of these things that were sort of regularly available. And I think back to our keynote speaker from this morning, who was talking about sort of the informal way that OER existed before we sort of formalized it. And that's how I was teaching classes almost all of the time because of this problem with buying books. So then Donnie and I sat down with Michelle and started doing the planning.
And that's when Michelle became very, I mean, obviously she's been very instrumental in our entire process, but it was a very significant educational moment for both Amy and I, because we had some knowledge about copyright and how to curate and create open educational resources, but Michelle largely helped guide us in understanding what we needed to look for, knowing where to find those options of pre-existing open texts that we could look at. And eventually what we did is we spent an entire summer essentially after having these meetings with Michelle, putting together these different segments of our book inspired by other texts, but we also incorporated some of our own original content as well, which as writers, Amy and I both really enjoyed that opportunity, because we were able to think about how this textbook would play out in our own classes and adapt what we saw from other textbooks in order to fit our students specifically. And I think that's what makes OER so exciting as well, is because it's such an adaptable means to create educational materials, right? So like any institution can do that.
And as we were doing our summer research, thanks to all of the resources that we got from Michelle, we started collaborating with people we didn't even know. It turns out that we used 4 major texts. Those are all listed in our introductions, but we adapted material from 4 different textbooks that were out there. Donnie and I had both been teaching this course, so we had materials passed down from previous professors who had taught the course, materials that we had used in our writing classes, in order to sort of like smush this big thing together. When we first came across all of the materials, it really felt pretty daunting. But we were, you know, we're writers. So we did a lot of working with the tone and the language and the format in Microsoft Word before we started moving on to other sort of ways of trying to figure out how to publish this thing.
Exactly. And ultimately, like, while like it was a very fulfilling process, let's just say. Like Amy was mentioning, the fact that we are writers and we got to tackle like a lot of these different challenges, it really left us feeling wholesome, knowing that we could use our own creative ingenuity in conjunction with these other resources. So, and we're going to be showing you what our textbook looks like here in a down the road in our presentation. So, Amy, is there anything else that we need to add for this, or do we want to move on to our next Q&A segment?
Well, I think we're going to touch on instructional design and technology later, but I think, yeah, I'd like to hear from the rest of the group, right? If anyone has questions about how did we do what we did. Oh, and I know that you have a question for our audience as well.
I do. Okay, so while you were thinking of questions, everyone, I do have another question to pose. And that is, how have you began the process of creating / wow, I cannot spell today. There we go. how have you began the process of creating and or curating OER texts?
While we wait for other people's answers, I have been continuing to curate and create OER texts for all of my classes. And currently, one of the things that we were talking about early on is that you don't have to figure, like, because of the grant and the timeline for our grant, we were putting this thing together all at once. But we learned really quickly that we were using materials that we already had and sort of just compiling them. So right now, all of my OER is not necessarily in textbook form. I'm using it via our learning management system. So I create units with individual links. Hypothetically, and hopefully in the future, I will have the opportunity to create all of these courses as like single textbooks, because I really feel that that format's helpful.
Agreed. I've also continued creating and curating OER texts, but the beauty of OER is that if you don't feel comfortable creating or curating necessarily, like if you connect with, you know, research professionals, they will be able to connect you with different materials out there. For example, attending one of the previous Michigan OER summits, I attended a presentation of composition instructors where they presented on this large like Google Doc textbook, basically containing different themed articles. It's called 88 Open Essays. And I've used it since that presentation in my Composition 2 classes, and it's been very well received by my students. So like there are materials out there. It's just a question of knowing where to find those.
And something to remember, there's always new textbooks being written. There's a composition book that OpenStax is going to reveal within the next few months, I think, that will be really exciting as a jumping off point if you don't want to use the composition book as in its entirety. But there's always something new out there. So don't look once, decide that there's nothing that fits your needs, and then just give up.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. Considering I teach 3 different ways, 3 different forms of composition every semester, I'm really exciting.
Mhm.
So we got 2 answers here. Laura Cottrell says LCC Board of Trustees set aside money for the OER initiative. That's amazing, which allows faculty incentives to create OER and pull in our library who creates LibGuides. I think that that's magnificent. So having like the OER available within the library's infrastructure that's already there, and then also having it outside, that's pretty cool. And then Karen Noel, Walsh has not started creating text yet. We're working on sustainability, right? We have instructors are using their own materials. Yeah, so that's kind of how it happens, right? So even if you haven't like done this official, I'm creating OER, you're using, like if you're using your own productions in your classes, you are in fact using OER. And it may only be available to you in your classes, but I think some of the things that we did with this book is to sort of extend that, right? So that anyone, anywhere can use some part or all of our book. And I think that's really awesome.
Then Nancy Shore says that my group has started to curate materials like primary sources and political cartoons and uploading them into a LibGuide. We have a fantastic librarian on our team who is helping us. That's so awesome to hear. Good, good. Jessica Bishop says, I plan to review materials for a future OER project, but I will comment on the power of social to find amazing OER resources, in particular instructional design related subjects have been exploding.
For real.
Yes.
So one of the things that that has been really interesting with instructional design related subjects, yeah, social media. Like there are so many teacher groups that I'm in now where everyone is just spitting things out, and I love that, for real.
Agreed. And it works within a lot of students' comfort zones as well. So like, and of course, like we're going to be talking about later on during this panel, like our goal, of course, is to get student interest too. Like that's just as important as getting faculty interest. By the way, thank you, Tina, for sharing that collection of essays in the chat. I really appreciate it. I strongly encourage everyone to check that out. It's a really good resource. Anyway, what were we going to say, Michelle?
Tina is one of the authors of that book.
I was going to say, I'm fairly sure that name sounded very familiar. Tina, thank you so much. It's an amazing book.
It is, yes.
I am so glad you're using it. It was a labor of love.
I can imagine. A lot of hard work was definitely put into that. Nancy asks, can you give an example of someone to follow on Twitter for OER/instructional design, please? I don't think I have any Twitter resources specifically.
Mine are all
that I can think
Facebook.
of.
Yeah, mine are all Facebook groups, but I will type a couple in here. My favorite right now is Pandemic Pedagogy. It's an open group.
I did have a colleague who used Twitter, but the Twitter was deleted a long time ago because it was just used for this one class. Essentially, they encouraged their students to create a Twitter account and interact with this like educational Twitter account that would post reading materials and updates on current events. And there were like writing exercises created to connect with that. I wish it was still out there. That would have been really helpful to see as an example as well.
I would love it
Let's see, Jean.
if anybody has if anybody has other like instructional designers or OER people to follow, please put those in the chat because I'd love to have those too.
Thank you, Gina, for sharing that Twitter handle. Perfect.
So
Okay.
professional development and collaboration in the 21st century, right? We're talking about Facebook as professional development. We're right now doing a chat where we're sharing, resources. This is magic.
Love it. It's making my day, honestly.
Yes.
Okay, so moving on to the next segment of our presentation. And this is the one I'm going to give to Michelle to talk a little bit about the significance of collaborating with library staff. So take it away, Michelle.
Thanks, Donnie. I'm just a little bit prejudiced here about libraries since I'm a librarian, but I think that your library staff should be your best friend when working on OER books. They're super searchers, so they can find anything. One of the textbooks that was just written was a sociology book, and they wanted it to be up to date. So they put in the election results from the 2020 election. They waited until right after the election so they could put in the election results. And they really wanted resources from the 3 counties that Delta covers, and they were having a hard time finding it. I talked to one of my librarians within 5 minutes. She sent them links and directions in a little video on how to find everything they needed to put in their book. Obviously, librarians aren't the only ones that are super searchers, but they're a great resource. They are subject specialists, so they're going to know a little bit about your topic. Obviously, the instructor is going to be the end specialist who's going to choose the content that goes in there. Most colleges have research guides, and they can create a guide for OER if they don't already. I'm willing to bet that most of them already do. If you just Google guide, OER guide, you're going to find guides from tons of colleges out there. They are going to know about open authoring sites. Librarians are usually copyright gurus, and they're learning Creative Commons. Just yesterday, I learned about a site where there's free music. And so you can have music on while you're playing copyright free music while you're waiting for your class to start, which I thought was so cool. And I learned it from another librarian. They just have tons of things. They have books. They can help you find ancillaries, which are always a concern for faculty. And there's new ones being developed all the time. So again, you never want to give up. Keep going back to the librarian, keep bugging her or him and saying, hey, did you forget about me? I'm still looking for this. Here at Delta, the librarians will be working with Pressbooks to assist faculty in getting their books into press books and published. I know Donnie and Amy are going to cover that in a little bit, but those are just some of the reasons. Contact your librarian right away.
So I want to say something that kind of reflects on what you just said, is that when you do your own search, sometimes, particularly in my discipline in English, you find too much, right? And I don't know what's what. And I feel like, particularly when we started our search, Michelle was able to say, wait, don't do that. Here are places to start. These are sources that I think are closer to what you want. And so we just had conversation with you, right? Where it was like, this is what we're looking for. This is the specific content we want. And like magic, because I feel like librarians are just magic people. You know, just a couple of days later, we get 15 links in our email, which, yeah, if I would have started the search myself, I would have read through, like literally read through multiple books before finding even one of the ones that I really wanted. Mm-hmm.
I think, look, I completely agree with both of you, by the way. I think what really makes OER intimidating is that it just seems so big. Like it's such a large thing, right? And I know a lot of faculty are discouraged from it because of that inherent largeness. So for me, like at the beginning of the whole process, like I was excited, don't get me wrong, but I was also extremely intimidated. Like I was an adjunct faculty member. I didn't know if I had the time to dedicate to doing all of this research and all of that, but having a librarian to point me in a direction and to provide me some semblance of comfort and education, that made it much more rewarding. It helped me feel a little bit more connected with my campus. And I think that has the potential to just make OER a good modeled experience for other people to also get into it and enjoy it. So thank you, Michelle, and other librarians and research experts. You were totally awesome. We appreciate you. So let's see, moving forward to our next Q&A segment.
Does anybody have questions for Michelle? Any faculty in here who would like, you know, some to ask her something? And also, Donnie's going to be typing up a question here.
Sorry, I was getting distracted by looking at the,
the chat box. Yeah.
So question number 3 is, what staff have you collaborated with to make OER possible at your institution?
I tell my students that there are two sets of people they need to know when they become college students. The first is go meet and know a librarian and feel comfortable with them. And number 2, your division secretary. At my college, there is no such thing as that, but then I tell them I kind of function as a division secretary because secretaries and librarians rule the world.
You know, it's like, while there might be some people thinking about this, like I think librarians and secretaries don't get enough credit for what they do with like building bridges across campuses, right? Because they are often the first people that faculty will see, the first people that students will see. And that's an incredible amount of influence, I think. And without that, like, I think that academia would feel extremely isolating in a variety of different ways, right? So I'll probably wait for another minute or so to see if anybody has any responses to question number 3.
That is awesome to get dean support. And then, so Nancy Sure says that we've had support from our dean and our teaching center. I never thought about that before. So I'm assuming your teaching center is like a support tutorial place. I never thought about getting them involved, but that's excellent, because then you could do smaller like OER guides for individual subjects, right? Like the same way that we do when we pull things from, make worksheets and stuff at the Writing Center. I love that. Oh, how cool.
Same here. Let's see. Maggie says, speaking as a librarian, enthusiastic faculty members, instructional designers, and institutional advancement staff have been instrumental. Yes. Laura, I don't think we've read Laura's yet, right? Laura says that LCC librarians, division lead support, both have been instrumental. We also have our controller in the finance office involved in OER.
Yeah.
Our provost too is on board. Good.
I never
So that
thought about having
information is
someone,
coming-
right, like never thought about having someone in finance fully involved, right? Like, because you're always trying to get money,
Right.
but why not get that person?
Mhm.
Yeah.
At
love
Delta,
this.
like speaking of that, like at Delta, like if we think of other departments where there is some sort of OER presence, I know student advising
Mhm.
is familiar with OER and
Right.
will happily discuss OER options with students. So
Mhm.
that's another example of that here at Delta. Clayton says we work with our Office of Teaching and Learning as well. Jessica says with COVID-19, one of the librarians became more embedded in our instructional design team. We're looking to find faculty to partner with both groups in OER collaborations.
I love that idea. So once upon a time, and someone's going to have to remind me what institution it's in, we had embedded librarians in developmental courses. Did we do that at Delta?
I think that was at
SDSU?
Saginaw Valley State
Okay.
University. Yep.
So Donnie and I both adjuncted at multiple similar institutions. But anyway, so that's the idea, like having these people part of the team. And Michelle, you were talking about the fact that a formal team has been created at Delta, and that might be, so I was talking like, you know, I have ulterior motives for this presentation. I'm also looking to sort of more formalized OER at the tribal college. One of our biggest hurdles is getting textbooks to students or getting students to buy textbooks. And so to formalize it would be great. And I like the idea of having librarians, an instructional designer, like creating a real team to move OER forward. So thank you all. This is just such great information.
We are really loving this conversation. Okay, so moving on to our next section here, we're going to be talking a little bit about understanding interfaces. So we, of course, used Pressbooks as our interface to publish our textbook, Literacy for College Success. So I'm going to stop the share here and let Amy share Pressbooks, our book on Pressbooks, so you can see what it looks like. All right.
All right, can you guys see my Pressbook screen?
I can see it perfectly on my end.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
I have two screens, so I'm always worried, do I have the right screen up? Okay, so here's our Pressbooks interface. We used the free version of Pressbooks, which has tons and tons of wonderful things and a couple of downfalls. So when we had created our text, Donnie, as you saw earlier in our presentation, had an actual cover that he designed himself. It's a photograph he took. It's wonderful. However, our data limit at Pressbooks does not allow us to have a cover. So when you go online, you don't actually get to see the cover. But when you do look at the book, you'll see, you know, the cover page and then a table of contents. My favorite thing about this whole interface is that there is a way to organize and skip around. So when I'm teaching the class, you know, if we're all done with Unit 1, students don't have to click all the way through. They can go directly to Unit 2 and they will see the unit contents. From there, you can click through this interface to go through as you want to. They have these nice little boxes where you can make homework boxes or activity boxes. So that's a really functional element so that the textbook doesn't just work as like a reading thing and then you have activities separate. You can have the activities worked right into the actual interface. And so the exercises box is different than the homework box. You can also include links. So this is a YouTube video that you can link out to, and you continue to pull in. The reason I chose this particular chapter is that at this point in time, I literally can't tell you how much of this is original work that Donnie and I have created, and how much we have used and adopted from other people. So when you find Creative Commons licensing, you have to find the ones that are going to let you do what it is that you want to do. So some of the vocabulary strategies and the context clues probably came from Bozarth. And then once we come down to morphemes and words, you're bringing this in from a different text altogether. And on occasion, we would add bulleted lists that we were using in our texts in our classes prior to that. So just like an example of how something that used to be maybe 4 or 5 different texts have come into a single chapter that sort of unifies the classroom as it is. And then I did want to mention, on the introduction and acknowledgements page, we described what we were doing because we wanted to give as much credit to the original authors as we could, and explained how we used each one of these individual authors within the book, and then linked to all of their open resources. I find that a lot of Creative Commons licensed open resources do the same thing. So we found this to be the best way to give credit to these sources without linking at the bottom of every page, every chapter. All right, Donnie, would you like to, do you want me to show the back end?
Yeah, sure. And while you're showing the back end, I can talk a little bit about working with an instructional designer for this. So one of my favorite aspects of working on this OER was working with our instructional designer, Claudia Howery, who is a wonderful human being. And essentially, like when we were first starting to compose this book, we started in Microsoft Word. Like we were just kind of like using that to create the skeletal structure of the book. And we obviously needed some place to publish it. That's when we were pointed in the direction of Pressbooks. And she was largely responsible for helping like teach me how to use Pressbooks, guide me on like the process behind like uploading things, creating assignments, formatting, because obviously looking at the back end of this, like at first, like I'm a very tech savvy person, but even I was extremely intimidated by this. And I really did not know where to begin, but working with an instructional designer, like helped, like through her vision, helped me understand like the significance of working an interface like this. And I think that's why it's also important to include those individuals in OER collaborations as well. So this is the back end of it.
Go ahead. Yep.
No, I was just going to say, this is the back end of it, and you can see like where we can like add in, we can organize things differently. Like when we open up a specific chapter, we can actually, like it opens up a text box and we can type and format in it. And it also shows like a history of revisions, which we really appreciated because of the unique thing about this textbook. And I think Amy may have mentioned this. We were able to go through and make adjustments to it, like from semester to semester, because we may have found something that did not work for our classes. We may have found something else that worked better. We were able to go in and actually switch those things out or omit certain items or include new content that we would end up using in a new class, right? And it ended up working for us considerably.
And one of the things I wanted to point out really quickly is that, and I clicked back and forth while he was talking, but you can see what it looks like on the page. And you can also, if you're more tech savvy, look at the code that's related here, and kind of a learning process. So I learned HTML 20 years ago. And then when we got here, I was like, yeah, I can't do this. And then, you know, it gets a little easier, but you can sort of reteach yourself a few things by seeing both the code and the visual. Mm-hmm.
You know, like after we worked on this, like I literally was like, wow, this is stuff that I remember doing on MySpace years and years ago. But yeah, that is the back end of Pressbooks, so you can see what it looks like. I will, Amy, if you want to end your share, I will put back up the slideshow so we can move on to our next Q&A segment. Okay. Here we go. All right. So For our next Q&A segment, of course, feel free to pose any questions that you may have, but we also wanted to ask for question number 4, what interfaces or modes of publication have you used to distribute your OER materials?
This is another one of those alternative motives of mine. Like, I am very, very interested in doing more, this book wouldn't have happened in Pressbooks without Claudia and Donnie, because I do not have that sort of super techie brain that I feel like I would have, like, now that it's all set up, I can help, change it up a little bit. But I want more ideas of different interfaces that I can use or that I can help teach to other faculty at my college to sort of help them, move. God, I wish we had Canvas. I hear all of this Canvas, right? Like Canvas Commons and Pressbooks, Canvas, Google Sites, OpenStax, Lumen. Lumen is kind of one of the most amazing places I've ever been in my life.
Agreed,
I use
100%.
Moodle. So I've heard about Moodle. I never thought about, like, I haven't used it. I've looked into it, but I think that now I've heard Moodle 20 times in like one day. So I think that's going to be on my list of things to use.
Noted. I'm like writing a little sticky note of notes here.
Parses out the chapters really well. Thank you. That's one of the things that I always like worry about with these interfaces is, can I move through things? So, okay, so two things. Jessica, you said Schoology is popular with K-12. That's actually what we use Schoology at Saginaw Chippewa Tribal College. And it is very much geared for K-12. And I can use it to like in LMS to do units and stuff, but it's still really broken up. So I think that's cool. And I did say, Nancy said there's a few negatives about Pressbooks. What would she look out for? Data limitations. The amount of space that you can take up in a free Pressbooks account. So I know that the text that we found, we had to remove some of the graphics, which we both were very sad to have go. So there were some graphics that were really demonstrative of the lesson that was being learned, like a cartoon or sometimes a graph or sometimes just a photograph. Like one of my favorites is this photograph of a cigarette ad that tells people how cigarettes are good for your health. And so we talk about, facts versus opinions and fact checking and stuff. And we did manage to keep that one in, but it was one of the few that we were able to fight to keep, but we lost a bunch more because our storage limits were met. And we don't really have a lot. It's mostly text, but the storage limits were really limiting. And that's only in the free version of Pressbooks. If your institution would get a big old fat grant and pay for, the upgraded version, then you could use Pressbooks without any limitations and it'd be amazing.
Can I chime in here, Amy?
Yes, please.
I think that after you two did your book, Pressbooks discontinued the free account, and now it's like $19.95, but there is a space limitation. I know that the sociology people they used their PD money. It was $100 or like $99.98, and it had more space allowed to it.
I think
so that would be like $90 some a year for that, right?
I think it's a one-time thing.
Okay.
The Michigan Colleges Online did look into getting an account for all the colleges, and it would be like thousands of dollars a year, and we'd be limited to 2 books a year.
Okay.
It's just not worth it.
It's not. That's why I remember when we were doing this back in 2018, that's where we ran into that. The cost was prohibitive in order to create like a paid account that would, have, So, and that's the other question Clayton brought up, long-term preservation, if it's a one-time cost. So if you pay once and, Pressbooks goes belly up, of course your internet stuff lasts forever, but can you, upgrade it? Can you,
Right.
will the functionality remain? And that's a question with all of our cloud storage, right? That's That is, you know, if the internet, you know, if electricity died, right? There's all those sci-fi movies. What would the problem be? Nicole asked, where can you export a Pressbook to? Wonderful question. It will export a PDF, and you can link directly to the online version. One thing that we learned about PDFs, if you export the PDF for digital use, there is no watermark. However, the pagination gets all screwed up. I spent a significant amount of time. This is one of the biggest hurdles that we ran into after we published it for the classroom, is that we wanted students to have a physical copy because a lot of our students have access issues, right? Students can only have a phone to get on online at home, or they're sharing their computer with 3 other siblings, or they just don't have internet at home. So we wanted to be able to create it in a printed form so the students would have it in addition to online. Luckily, Delta College was amazing and allowed all of the students to print their books. However, before they could print them and have them in readable format without either a huge watermark, and the watermark printed like so dark, you could barely read what was behind it, that I ended up using our Adobe software in the library and repaginating the entire book for the printed version. So that was another kind of hurdle with the free version, which I think is equal to this 1995 version that they have. So yeah, limitations exist in Pressbooks. I love that everything's in one place. I love that I can update it constantly. So every semester, still to this day, even though neither one of us, I think, is even teaching this class anymore, we're still using portions of this book and still updating things. Like we'll email each other, hey, so in chapter 3, I found this better reading. What do you think? Yes, that sounds good. We change it in the book, it's updated right away. We can use it right away.
Yeah, it just makes it so much more convenient. Not to mention I've used it for other classes as well, like certain segments of it. That's what makes it convenient. So we only have a couple of minutes left. So what I think we should do, we should move forward and talk about our last couple of points and see if anybody has any lingering questions. If there are questions after the fact, we do have our emails provided at the beginning of this presentation also. We really wanted to touch on student perspective on OER because throughout our entire process working with OER at Delta, we've been really wanting to enlist student interest to get them to understand the excitement of OER and what it does for them. So at the end of every class that we've done, at least, and Michelle, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but at the end of most classes at Delta, we distribute a survey to students for them to fill out so they can share their thoughts. Michelle, do you want to talk a little bit about that survey?
Sure. I send the survey link out to faculty so that they can share it with their students. It probably takes about 5 minutes to take. It asks basic questions, whether they liked the book, whether they thought it was better or worse than a book that they paid for. Did they have any suggestions on the book? The majority of students don't see a difference between the OER textbook and another textbook. The big thing for them is it's free and it's available forever. There are students who prefer a print copy, so there's always a print copy available either in the bookstore or they can just print it off at the college.
Indeed. Thank you, Michelle, for sharing that. And because I use OER in more advanced composition courses, students, I'm very transparent with my students about the fact that I am using and assessing an OER text. So I will let them know that, hey, I'm going to periodically ask you questions about this text to see how it's working for you, so on and so forth. And they really enjoy participating in that dialogue because it empowers them and knowing that they do have some sort of influence in how it's going to shape the future of that class and the use of that text. So Amy, did you want to add anything on?
Yeah, I was going to say, we piloted this in a summer course in the summer of 2019. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, in the summer of 2019, we did a pilot summer course that I was teaching. And that's when we encountered all of the problems you can possibly encounter in a very short period of time, which was great because then I had a small class. I only had 10 students in there. I could spend a lot of one-on-one time with them. And as they were telling me what issues they were having with the book, or if a link wasn't working, I literally could open up the book. I would show them the back end. I would make the change right in front of them. And they were like, oh my God, that's so cool. So you can literally fix our textbook and make it what we want as you're teaching us. I'm like, yeah. And they thought it was just the coolest thing. And getting real-time student input on how a textbook was working, like Donnie said, is completely invaluable. Like, yeah, I can't imagine going back to a book that somebody else wrote that I can't fix or change or, adapt in a way that works for my students.
Indeed. So I'm gonna conclude with this one last tidbit that, like, Amy and I never expected our journey in OER to lead to the different opportunities that we've experienced. Like of course we created this textbook. We've got to work with different wonderful colleagues across our college, through our colleges, I should say. And last but not least, we've also had some recent opportunities to take our experiences, put them in a chapter format, and submit that for publication. Something else that has been beneficial for us, because we've been able to collaborate with librarians like Michelle to point us in the directions of places that are accepting publications or putting out calls for chapters for OER texts. So it's an exciting experience.
Absolutely. And the collaboration doesn't stop. Like, just because I'm over at SCTC and they're at Delta, literally we had our chapter, we wrote a chapter, and it kind of fell through. And we talked to Michelle, and Michelle, being an amazing, colleague and person that we now know because of OER, it put us in touch with a half dozen other librarians around the state who gave recommendations on other places where we can, shop out our chapter. And, case in point, we're all here right now. I feel like the collaboration that we just got in the chat alone is like a year's worth of research, right? That we could, that we wouldn't have necessarily found if we wouldn't have gotten into this as a professional development opportunity as it is. I'm always thinking of the different ways that OER is beneficial for faculty in particular. And this is it, right? Now, there's not a lot of monetary gain from doing OER, but so the student success rates enormously improved by having customized textbooks. And then my own professional development, like what I learned in the process of creating this book, priceless. And then, lifelong, colleagues that you can use to continue learning, continuing professional development is just awesome.
Agreed. Gina, do you have any closing statements?
I did. I was just going to say, I'm sorry to interrupt such a great conversation.
Oh, no,
I mean, this has
good.
been absolutely wonderful. I know we've kind of dipped into the break time a little bit, but it was so rich. It's such a great conversation. I didn't want to interrupt. So I just want to invite everybody. I want to thank you for coming to this session and the entire summit. There is one more session. It's the wrap up for the day and the raffle drawing. So get your lucky boots on. And we've got about a 5-minute break built in. And then at 3 o'clock, we're going to start a session for that raffle. Won't last super long, but I want to thank the presenters, Donnie, Amy, Michelle. Thank you for sharing all of your insights and what you have learned along your journey. I know I've been here taking notes, even though I'm on the K-12 side, but there's so much that we can continue to share that I just appreciate all of your knowledge and your journey that you're sharing with all of us. And if all of you have a question, I just want to remind you, like Amy said earlier, if you want a copy of the chat, they're down in the chat box. There are 3 buttons down there, 3 dots. If you click on that, you can save the chat, and then you get your own copy of it so that you can go back through and look at those questions and those resources that were shared today. So please do that. And with that, I will say thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.